December 22nd, 1944. The forest had been silent for hours. Not the silence of peace, but the thick, muffled quiet that comes when fog settles so heavily that sound itself seems to freeze in the air. Along the southern approaches to Bastogne, in the last days of December 1944, German sentries stood in positions they had occupied for less than a week. Some were dug into hasty foxholes, others crouched behind fallen timber or the stone walls of abandoned farms. They stamped their feet against the cold and strained to see more than 30 meters in any direction. The weather had become their greatest ally. For days, the low ceiling and perpetual fog had grounded the American aircraft that everyone feared. Without air support, the enemy's advantage in materiel meant less. Without observation, their artillery fire became guesswork. The German offensive that had punched westward through these forests 2 weeks earlier had relied on exactly this kind of cover. Now, as the exhausted formations tried to hold what they had taken, the same weather was buying them time. The men on the line knew the Americans were somewhere to the south. Intelligence reports placed enemy columns on the roads beyond the ridgeline, moving slowly, contested at every crossroads. The prevailing assumption was that any relief effort would be gradual, methodical, and easily detected. American forces were not known for reckless movement in winter conditions. They would consolidate. They would wait for air cover. They would advance with overwhelming preparation. This was what the briefings had said. This was what made sense. In a command post housed in the cellar of a farmhouse 3 kilometers from the front, a signals officer reviewed the morning's reports. Radio traffic had been light. A few outposts reported hearing vehicles in the distance, but vehicles were always moving somewhere. Supply trucks, reconnaissance units, retreating columns. There were 100 explanations. The sounds were dismissed as routine. The fog made everything uncertain. Men heard what they expected to hear, or what their nerves suggested. One report came in from a forward observer near a hamlet that no longer had a name on anyone's map. He claimed to have heard tracked vehicles, possibly armor, moving in formation. The transmission was garbled. The observer's position was exposed. His unit had been under intermittent mortar fire for 2 days. Fatigue and stress were considered more likely explanations than an armored breakthrough. The report was logged and set aside. By mid-morning, the fog had thickened further. Visibility dropped to less than 20 meters in some sectors. Men moved carefully between positions, guided by memory and the faint outlines of landmarks. Communication between units became sporadic. Field telephones worked when the lines had not been cut by shell fire. Radio sets functioned poorly in the cold and damp. Runners carried messages on foot, slipping through the trees, their breath visible in short bursts. It was during one of these intervals, around 1100 hours, that the sounds became impossible to ignore. At first, it was a low rumble, felt as much as heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, absorbed and reflected by the fog in ways that made direction meaningless. Some soldiers thought it was distant artillery. Others assumed it was aircraft, though none could be seen. A few recognized the deep grinding resonance of heavy engines under load. But without visual confirmation, the recognition remained abstract. A machine gun crew positioned along a sunken road heard it clearly. The sound was growing louder, more distinct. One man suggested they send a runner back to report. Another argued it was nothing, that the fog was playing tricks. They waited. The sound continued. A kilometer to the west, A platoon leader tried to raise his company commander on the radio. The connection was poor, static, overlapping voices. He reported what his men were hearing. The response was curt. Maintain position. Do not abandon posts based on unconfirmed reports. The artillery will cover any approach. But the artillery was scattered across a broad front, low on ammunition, operating under the same conditions that limited everyone else. Forward observers could not see targets. Fire missions were based on map coordinates and guesswork. The assumption remained that any American advance would be slow enough to detect and engage. The assumption was wrong. The tanks came out of the fog without warning. They did not announce themselves with distant silhouettes or the gradual buildup of noise. They simply appeared, enormous, immediate, like ships emerging from a bank of sea mist. The lead vehicles were Shermans, moving in a staggered column along a secondary road that intelligence had deemed impassable for armor. Behind them came more tanks, and behind those, half-tracks and trucks carrying infantry. The machine gun crew along the sunken road saw the first Sherman at a distance of less than 50 meters. For a moment, no one moved. The tank's engine was idling. Its turret traversed slowly. Then it fired. The muzzle flash lit the fog from within. The concussion rolled across the frozen ground like a physical blow. The machine gun position ceased to exist. Other units along the line had seconds to react. Most of those seconds were spent in disbelief. The defensive positions had been sighted with the expectation of stopping infantry, not armor. Anti-tank guns were in place, but many were positioned for fields of fire the fog had rendered useless. Crews scrambled to reorient their weapons. The tanks were already past some positions before the Germans realized they were there. A Panzerfaust team moved into position along a stone wall. They waited until a Sherman was within range. They fired. The shaped charge struck the tank's front glacis at an angle and failed to penetrate. The turret swung toward the source. 2 shots. The wall disintegrated. Radio discipline collapsed. Multiple units tried to report simultaneously. Voices overlapped. Static drowned meaning. Officers shouted for confirmation of what was already obvious. Requests for artillery support went unanswered or arrived too late. Some units withdrew without orders. Others held their positions and were bypassed or overrun. In the command post cellar, the signals officer tried to make sense of the reports flooding in. The Americans were not supposed to be this far forward. The weather was not supposed to allow coordinated movement. The expected timeline had collapsed into a single, chaotic morning. He reached for the field telephone. The line was dead. The fog began to thin shortly after noon. It did not lift cleanly. It retreated in patches. A stretch of road crowded with American vehicles, a burning farmhouse, a column of German prisoners being marched south. Each glimpse made the situation clearer. And worse. German units tried to establish new defensive lines, but the momentum was entirely with the Americans. Patton's tanks did not pause. They pressed forward, accepting risk, exploiting confusion. Behind the armor came infantry in sufficient numbers to hold what had been taken. The operational tempo was faster and more aggressive than German doctrine anticipated. Some positions held for hours. A company of Fallschirmjäger stopped 2 Shermans with well-placed Panzerfaust shots. They held a crossroads until nightfall. An 88mm gun crew destroyed 3 tanks before being silenced by artillery. Isolated successes. Local. Temporary. Unable to alter the collapse. By mid-afternoon, the weather cleared in earnest. Patches of blue sky appeared. The fog retreated to the valleys. And then the aircraft came. Thunderbolts, Mustangs, low, fast, methodical. They strafed roads and tree lines. They came again and again. German soldiers who had endured tank fire ran from the sound of aircraft. There was no cover that mattered, no foxhole deep enough. The psychological effect was immediate. The sky, once neutral, was now hostile. Movement invited attack. Supply columns scattered. Communications failed. Units dissolved into fragments. A battalion commander attempted a counterattack. Only half the units received the order. Those that moved were caught in the open and destroyed. The counterattack ended before it began. By evening, the fog returned, but it no longer mattered. The Americans were within 5 kilometers of Bastogne. Radio intercepts confirmed contact. The encirclement was broken. German officers studied maps by candlelight. The front line was no longer a line. Entire companies were missing. The mood was not panic. It was finality, the recognition that the initiative was gone. And with it, the possibility of success. Survivors spoke in fragments. Tanks in the fog, positions bypassed, aircraft from clear skies, everything happening too fast. What they did not say immediately was what mattered most. That intelligence had failed, that assumptions were outdated, that speed and aggression now belonged entirely to the enemy. The relief of Bastogne was confirmed on December 26th. The offensive was over. What remained was withdrawal, under pressure, without illusion. For the men who had stood in the fog that morning, the memory endured, not because of heroism, but because certainty had dissolved in minutes. The fog returned many times that winter, but belief did not. It had been left behind in frozen forests south of Bastogne. The forest eventually returned to silence, not the silence of waiting, but the silence that follows defeat. Snow covered the scars. Positions disappeared, and the men moved on, carrying the sound of engines in the fog, the sound of an ending.